When I was young, I found one hammer and I found some nails and I found some pieces of plywood. And as it would be expected of a child, I started hammering the nails into these pieces of plywood, and I was generally fooling around with that whole act of hammering nails into the wood. My dad saw this and he was observing. My dad is not really trained as an engineer, but he's quite a tinkerer. At home, we call him the engineer because he really understands science and engineering at a pretty deep level. So he was looking at me, and he was not trying to stop me, which is why he's such a great guy. And he was just observing what I was doing. So I was using that hammer to nail a thick piece of plywood onto a thin piece of plywood. So the thin piece was below and the thick piece was on top, and I was using a big nail and it was being driven from top down into the thin piece. So my dad came to me and said, "That's not how you do it. You have to flip it around and the thin piece has to be on top of the thick piece. And then you nail from top and it will hold properly." So I remember being very thrilled with this observation, and I was asking him, why is it that the joint is weak when it's the other way around? So if you nail a thick piece of plywood to a thin piece from the top, the joinery is pretty flimsy. But the other way around, it joins pretty well. The nail goes in very well. It holds the two pieces of plywood very nicely. So today in this particular episode, I'm going to talk about skills and knowledge and get into some understanding of what's the difference between these two. My name is Sabu Francis, and this is part of archopus.com. Archopus is a finishing school for architecture. It's meant for students of architecture, people who want to get into architecture. It's meant for even regular architects who want to refresh their knowledge on architecture. And it's also meant for other teachers who want additional material on architecture. And a lot of the topics which we cover initially would be what is known as meta topics. That means not directly the topic itself, but a lot of knowledge around that topic. So in this particular episode, I'm going to talk about what's the difference between skills and knowledge. Because many times these two are confused with each other, they are conflated with each other, or one assumes that if you are skilled in something, you also have knowledge about that thing. Now, in information science, they say that there is a hierarchy of knowledge. So it starts with data. Data becomes information. Information can become knowledge. And wisdom is something which is probably has got a lot more philosophical component in it. So let's not discuss wisdom right now. We can start talking about data, information, and knowledge. Now, some of that information which we get are skills which we develop. Like I learned the skill of nailing on wood, hammering nails into wood, into plywood at least. And when my dad brought me some additional insight, he joined some other component of information and put it together with the knowledge of nailing. And suddenly I have a little bit of knowledge about how nailing needs to be done. Now, what's the difference between skills and knowledge? If you check on the internet, there are some interesting debates about these two. Somebody said that skill is something which you do with your hand and knowledge is something which you do with your brain, which is little odd, I think, because I think for skills also you have to use your brain. You cannot be brainless when you're hammering nails into pieces of wood. So I don't think that is a very good definition. It's probably a clever definition. It probably is alluding to the fact that possibly skills require much lesser amount of taxing your brain. whereas knowledge requires you to join pieces of information together, and then it's put together, and then you get knowledge. Now, coming back to that hierarchy which I was telling you, which is another way to look at this whole thing, is you start with some data and something happens to that data, and then it becomes information. Now, the thing which happens to the data technically is known as metadata. That means data about the data. Like, for example, if I were to take a blank piece of a checkbook, a blank leaf from a checkbook. So a blank leaf from a checkbook will have certain components which you have to fill in. So you have to fill in the date, you have to fill in the name, and you have to fill in the amount, and you have to sign it. Now, what makes that particular check useful is because you have filled in an amount, but that data does not become useful if you didn't put in the signature. Now, if you were to get $10,000 from one guy and $10,000 from another guy, if neither of them have signed the check, they're totally useless. You can't use those checks. And if one guy signed on one check and another guy signed on the other check, then you actually have two different pieces of information, because obviously this person is a different person because the signature says so, and that person is another person. So the metadata is data about that data which qualifies that particular pieces of data together, and then you get some little bit of information. Now, it becomes knowledge when you say that piece of check is used for something, some work which was done earlier, and that has to be paid for, and therefore it becomes now knowledge. Now, this is all technicalities. How does it affect architecture, and how does it affect an architecture student, and what do we do? Many architecture students I've seen, they get skilled at certain activities, like they are very good at drafting or they are very good at sketching. Now, somebody can argue that sketching does have a component of knowledge. Of course it does have that. I'm talking about that part of sketching where you know how to use your pencil and how to use your paper and how to stick the paper correctly, and the maintenance of your instruments. These are all things which are needed. So these are all the skill sets which you need. In drafting, you need to know how to use your set squares and T-squares and all the other drafting instruments, and they also will go into adding knowledge later on. But knowing at that level of just at the skill set level is insufficient. You need to go beyond that and then start connecting that piece of knowledge, information, and then gather knowledge together. This takes a little bit of effort. I've seen, for example, a student goes and learns about structure, for example, and learns about how the arch works. So that's learned and that's kept separately in the mind. And then later on, when I ask them, tell me, there are two arches which we use in the human body. Where are they and why are they there? And many students really do not understand where these two arches are. And what has happened is they have taken this piece of information, they got probably the skill set for understanding it by itself, but they have not been able to connect the other pieces of information, which is to understand your own body. Understanding the human body is a very important part of understanding architecture. What are the dimensions? How does the body work, at least physically works? I'm not saying that you learn as a doctor for medical purposes, but at least the way you can understand the structure works in your body, that would be pretty useful. But people do not know where are those two arches in your body. There's not one arch, there are two arches. Anyway, that I leave it to the audience for you to figure out where are the two arches. And when you get to connect that knowledge, that piece of information with this piece of information, and they get joined together, you get that epiphany and you say, wow, oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, there's something more to all this, which is more than the sum of both the parts. And this is very crucial if you want to make sense as an architect, if you want to be, as they say, creative. This is a kind of what is known as divergent thinking, where you deliberately bring in pieces of knowledge from different places and put them together. In today's times, there are a whole lot of skill set which you need to learn. For example, you need to learn computer programming. That's not an option. You have to understand computer programming because that's one of the tools which architects use, and few years from now it will be so common that you will have to get into that. So now to say no, computer programming is something somebody else does, it's not done by architects, I'm sorry. You should open your eyes and take a look at what other colleges of architecture all over the world are doing. You look at my own alma mater, IIT Kharagpur. I'm rather smug about it and I'm feeling rather pleased. Practically all the students there, by the time they are in third year and fourth year, they really know how to do programming. That's a skill set. It's not a piece of knowledge. You don't have to get worried. You don't have to think that there's something extraordinary in there. Long time back, architects never could go to a stationery shop and get a rapidograph pen and fill the ink, buy the ink and fill that ink and then use that. Architects had to make that pen. They had to grind the ink. They have to sometimes even make the canvas on which the drawing has to be done. So there's nothing unusual for an architect to learn all this skill set. That doesn't mean that they become automatically great architects. Of course, that's not how you do. You don't become knowledgeable. You get skilled, and you can't remain at that skill level. You have to take that skill and bring it as knowledge. And in this world which is emerging, the complicated world which is emerging, you will need a lot more skill sets than what was there earlier. Drafting drawings, there are some emotional attachment to that. There are some YouTube videos where architects claim that they do a much better job when they're sketching and all that. They're bringing in a lot of notional and emotional and subjective values, and which I agree it is there. Those subjective values are there. Of course, people are going to be emotional about the way they use their instruments and all that. Human beings were distinguished to be different from other animals because of their tool usage. So obviously tools are very close to a human heart, and therefore it's not surprising that people attach a lot of emotional values to sketching and painting and creativity and all that. But that by itself, I would say, are still just skills. You need to go beyond that, and you need to widen your brain on where you get these skills and what kind of skills you need to get, like computer programming, for example. And it doesn't really stop at computer programming. The world has opened up to a distributed way of working with architects and with other professionals. So you may be in one city and somebody else is in another city, and now you need to have the skills to interact properly and conduct your affairs of your office properly. So these are all skill sets which you need. And having those skill set, unfortunately, doesn't mean that you have the knowledge. You still have to then connect a lot more things together to get knowledge. Another thing about knowledge is that skills can lead to knowledge if you use those connections. But that knowledge itself is actually a skill for a higher level of knowledge. Like that example I gave about me learning to nail a thin plywood on top of a thick plywood was a little bit of knowledge about carpentry. But obviously that's actually a skill set for a carpenter. A carpenter will know how to do this, and he just takes that method of joining two pieces of plywood together as a matter of fact. But that doesn't mean that's really valuable knowledge. He goes further and he starts understanding where that knowledge has to be used. In which case do you join two pieces of plywood together with nails, and which other case you would use screws instead of nails. And then suddenly you find that there is within knowledge itself there are hierarchies, and the lower ones are the skills for the upper one, which is the knowledge which you use with the skills. And the same thing happens in architecture. People learn, for example, the skill of making brick joints, and then they need to understand why that brick joint works and why some other brick joint doesn't work. So that goes into knowledge, a little bit of knowledge in that local situation. But then later on you apply that knowledge further to a bigger piece of knowledge, and you say that, do you even use bricks at all? And if you do use bricks, which is that bond which you'd use? But this time now you are qualifying it with some additional pieces of information, and then you go further up. When Laurie Baker invented the rat trap bond, I really don't know whether he invented it or he promoted that particular bond, but let's assume that he invented it. So he came up with a very nice way of saving about 33% of the brick which is used in brick walls. But that by itself is not of any use unless you know where to apply that. And it becomes even more knowledgeable when you know where not to apply it, in which situation should you not use the rat trap bond, and so on and so forth. So to summarize, you need to learn the skills, you need to learn a wide set of skills, then you need to learn the knowledge by attaching many other pieces of information together to that particular skills which you have. And then you have to also respect the hierarchy of knowledge, and you have to walk up that particular hierarchy, walk up that ladder of knowledge, and get a lot more material with you for you to finally apply your creativity. So that's what happens in architecture, and that's what ideally should happen in architecture. If somebody thinks that he's a great draftsman, or somebody thinks he's a great coder and he can code programs, that unfortunately you are still living at a skill level and not really at the knowledge level. So thank you so much. This is just a brief idea about what is this whole thing about skills and knowledge. I hope you would join archopus.com. And we have a lot of mentors who will take up, who will mentor students who are coming into the chat system there. The chat system and the video system which we are having would be the main vehicles by which we are hoping to finish polish up the education, finish the education of architects who are coming out, and it will be useful even for fresh architects and other architects who want to renew their knowledge and keep updated. Thank you so much.